Some lives disappear quietly. No funeral, no missing posters, no one asking questions. They fade in places where walls still remember their breath, but the world has already moved on. I found one of those places by accident, a building sealed off from the street, its windows dark, its name removed from every map. Inside, there were signs of living. Shoes by the door. Name scratched into the wall. Beds made, as if someone expected to return. What disturbed me wasn't the abandonment. It was the absence of memory. When I searched for the people who once lived there, nothing existed. No records. No families. No proof they were ever real. Yet their photographs remained. Faces staring directly into the lens, frozen in moments that felt personal, intentional. These were not strangers posing for history. These were people trying to be remembered. The longer I looked at those photos, the more uncomfortable I became. Some expressions didn't feel finished, as if the person knew their life would stop right there. Others carried a quiet fear, like they understood something I didn't. I started to notice patterns, every life cut off, every trace removed, every story abandoned at the same point. That was when I realized the truth wasn't hidden in what was missing. It was hidden in why remembering them felt wrong, like my mind was resisting something it wasn't meant to uncover. As if these lives weren't just abandoned, they were pushed away. And now, by looking at them, I had stepped into the same silence they were trapped in. The discovery of the abandoned building did not happen through any official record or urban exploration log. It was found because it did not belong anywhere. It stood between two occupied structures, yet it was sealed off as if it had been deliberately removed from the flow of daily life. No signboard, no address number, no mention on city maps. People walked past it without slowing down, their eyes sliding over it as though their minds refused to register its presence. The first unsettling detail was that the building showed clear signs of habitation, not decay. The doors were locked, not broken. The windows were dusty, not shattered. This was not a place destroyed by time but abandoned by choice. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of human routine, old fabric, stale food, soap residue. Rooms were arranged with intention. Beds were neatly placed against walls. Chairs faced tables, not windows. In one corner, a calendar still hung, its last marked date circled carefully, as if someone had planned for a future that never arrived. Personal items were scattered throughout the space, worn shoes aligned near doorways, cups resting beside sinks, blankets folded rather than thrown aside. These were not the remains of people who fled in panic. These were the traces of lives paused mid-sentence. What made the discovery deeply disturbing was not the emptiness but the sense of interruption. Everything suggested continuity, as though the people who lived there fully expected to return. There were no signs of struggle, no emergency exits forced open, no evidence of sudden disaster. The building felt frozen in a moment of waiting. Even the dust seemed thin, as if time itself had been cautious about touching the place. It felt less like abandonment and more like removal, as though the occupants had been lifted out without warning. When questions were asked, the responses were always the same. Neighbors claimed they had never seen anyone enter or leave the building. Local authorities had no documentation of residence, ownership, or construction dates. Utility companies showed no history of service connections. It was as if the building had existed physically but never administratively. A structure full of human life, erased from every system designed to acknowledge existence. The most unsettling realization came slowly. This was not a single forgotten location but a deliberate omission. The building had not been lost to neglect, it had been excluded from memory. Every object inside served as proof that people once lived there, yet no external record confirmed they ever had. The discovery challenged a simple assumption, that existence guarantees remembrance, and replaced it with something far more disturbing, that lives can be quietly removed, leaving behind spaces that remember even when the world refuses to. The photographs were discovered in a locked cabinet pushed against the far wall of the building, protected not from decay but from being found. They were carefully arranged, not scattered or damaged, each one placed as if someone believed order could preserve identity. At first glance, they appeared ordinary, portraits of men, women, and children standing in plain rooms, sitting on steps, leaning against walls. There was nothing dramatic about their clothing or posture, nothing that suggested notoriety or importance. Yet something about them felt unsettling, not because of what they showed, but because of what they lacked. Each photograph was examined against every available record. Facial recognition systems found no matches. Census data returned nothing. Hospital archives, school enrollments, employment histories, immigration logs, all empty. It was as if these faces had never intersected with the mechanisms that define a person as real. Even more disturbing was the consistency. Every individual in the photographs existed only within the frame. Outside of it, they vanished completely. No duplicates. No alternate angles. No family photos stored elsewhere. Just single images, isolated and final. The expressions in the photographs carried a quiet tension. Some subjects stared directly into the camera, not with curiosity but with something closer to awareness. Others looked slightly away, as if distracted by something the photographer could see but chose not to capture. There were no smiles that felt natural. Even the children appeared restrained, their faces unusually composed, their eyes fixed with an intensity that did not match their age. The longer the images were studied, the clearer it became that these were not casual snapshots. They felt intentional, almost urgent, like proof gathered against an invisible threat. What made the photographs truly disturbing was their consistency across time. Clothing styles suggested different decades, yet the setting remained unchanged. The same walls, the same angles, the same background shadows appeared again and again, as if generations had passed through the same confined existence without ever leaving a trace beyond that space. It implied a cycle, not a moment, a repetition of lives that began and ended without acknowledgement. Attempts to contextualize the images failed. There were no photographer credits, no studio marks, no handwritten notes. The film type varied, but the framing never did. Someone had taken great care to document these people while ensuring nothing else about them survived. The photographs were not keepsakes. They were evidence, preserved with precision and stripped of connection. As the images accumulated, a troubling idea emerged. These people had not simply been overlooked by history. They had been recorded and then erased. The photographs were the only remnants that escaped deletion, fragments of lives that existed fully but were never allowed to leave a shadow in the world. Every face represented a complete human story reduced to a single frozen moment, and the realization settled in slowly, heavily, that someone had decided these people should only exist long enough to be seen once and never remembered again. Their idea that the people had been erased deliberately did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually, through patterns that were too precise to be accidental. Forgetting is usually uneven. It leaves gaps, contradictions, half-memories that refuse to align. What existed here was clean, controlled, and consistent. Every trace of these individuals ended at the same invisible boundary, as though their lives had been permitted to exist only within a narrow frame before being systematically removed. This was not neglect. It was design. The more records were examined, the clearer the intention became. It was not just that information was missing, it had been actively disconnected. Names that appeared briefly in handwritten notes were absent from every official registry. Dates that should have matched hospital logs or municipal files led nowhere. Even physical remnants outside the building were non-existent. No discarded mail, no personal belongings in second-hand markets, no whispers in local history. Erasure had extended beyond paper and memory into the physical world itself. What made this realization disturbing was the effort it must have required. Removing a person from history demands coordination, patience, and authority. It means intercepting documentation at every stage of a life, birth, education, employment, medical care, death. Someone had ensured these people never crossed into systems that grant permanence. They were allowed to live, but not to be acknowledged. Their existence was tolerated only as long as it left no mark. Subtle signs of resistance began to appear in the remnants left behind. Scratches on walls repeated the same symbols. Notes contained phrases that felt unfinished, as if written under constraint. In one room, a sentence had been carved into wood and then deliberately scratched out, not erased fully, but damaged enough to make reading it uncomfortable. It suggested awareness. These people had known something was happening to them. They understood that their lives were being contained, compressed into a space that would eventually be sealed. The realization shifted the meaning of the building itself. It was no longer just a forgotten place. It was a boundary. A controlled environment where lives could exist without leaking into the larger world. The building did not hide them, it isolated them. Everything inside it functioned as a closed loop, ensuring that nothing carried their presence outward. Even abandonment seemed intentional, a final step in making sure no one came looking. Once that thought settled, it became impossible to ignore the implications. If erasure was deliberate, then forgetting was not a failure of memory but a consequence of interference. Someone had decided that these people should not matter, should not be mourned, should not even be missed. Their disappearance was meant to feel natural, unquestioned, inevitable. The most unsettling part was not that this had happened, but that it had worked so well. Lives had been removed without protest, without inquiry, without consequence, and the world had continued forward without ever noticing the absence, which raised a final, dangerous question about how many other lives had been quietly edited out in the same way, and whether the only difference this time was that something had been left behind that refused to stay silent. The first signs that the abandoned lives were still aware did not announce themselves clearly. They appeared as inconsistencies, moments where the silence felt reactive rather than empty. While walking through the building, there was a sense of being observed that did not come from imagination alone. Certain rooms felt heavier when entered, as if presence accumulated there. Footsteps echoed differently depending on where one stood, not because of acoustics, but because the space seemed to respond. It was subtle enough to dismiss, yet persistent enough to return every time attention lingered too long. Objects began to feel less static. A chair that had been pushed aside appeared closer to the center of the room on the next visit. Curtains shifted despite sealed windows. Dust patterns changed in ways that did not match airflow or time. These movements were never dramatic, never enough to provoke alarm, but they carried intent. They suggested adjustment rather than decay. It felt as though the space was being maintained, not by hands, but by awareness. The photographs deepened this unease. When revisited after time had passed, some faces seemed different. Not altered in structure, but in expression. A gaze that once felt vacant now carried tension. Shadows appeared darker around certain figures, as if depth had increased where none should exist. These changes could not be documented reliably. Cameras captured nothing unusual. The effect existed only when viewed directly, creating the disturbing impression that the images responded to observation itself. The awareness did not feel hostile. It felt attentive, as if the forgotten lives were conscious of being noticed again after a long period of isolation. The longer attention was held on them, the stronger the sensation became. It was not the fear of being harmed, but the discomfort of being acknowledged by something that should not be able to acknowledge back. The boundary between observer and subject thinned in ways that felt psychologically invasive. Dreams began to change. Faces from the photographs appeared without context, not asking for help, not expressing anger, simply present. They stood in familiar rooms, watching, waiting. Waking from these dreams carried the same sensation felt inside the building, a lingering awareness that did not fade with daylight. The sense that remembering them had consequences became harder to ignore. It became clear that abandonment had not ended their existence. It had only altered the way they persisted. These lives had not moved on or dissolved. They remained suspended, aware of their own erasure, aware of being forgotten, and now aware of being seen again. That awareness carried weight, not as a threat, but as pressure, like something leaning closer without touching. The most disturbing realization was that attention itself seemed to sustain them. The more they were studied, the more present they felt. Forgetting had kept them contained. Remembering weakened whatever barrier had been placed around them, suggesting that the silence was not meant to protect the world from them, but to protect them from the world, because awareness did not free them, it bound them tighter to the moment they were erased, and by noticing them now, something dormant was being encouraged to wake, something that had been waiting in abandonment not for rescue, but for recognition. The cost did not arrive as fear or panic, but as erosion. Small changes appeared first, easy to dismiss. Concentration thinned. Time felt uneven, stretching in some moments and collapsing in others. Familiar thoughts began to feel rehearsed, as if they were being recalled rather than formed. The mind resisted this interpretation at first, offering rational explanations, but the resistance itself became exhausting. It felt like holding a door closed against pressure that never stopped pushing. Memory was the next thing to shift. Certain details from the photographs began to surface uninvited, interrupting unrelated moments. Faces appeared briefly in reflections, not clearly enough to confirm, but vividly enough to unsettle. The feeling was not hallucination, but intrusion. Thoughts no longer felt private. They carried an awareness that something else was present within them, observing the process rather than participating in it. Sleep offered no escape. Dreams lost their structure, repeating fragments without narrative or resolution. The same rooms appeared again and again, slightly altered each time, as if adapting. Waking did not restore clarity. Instead, the boundary between sleep and awareness blurred, leaving behind a residue of attention that lingered through the day. It became difficult to tell where observation ended and participation began. Language started to fail in subtle ways. Certain words felt wrong when spoken aloud, as if they no longer belonged to the same reality. Describing the experience created discomfort, not because it was frightening, but because articulation seemed to strengthen it. Silence felt safer, yet heavier. The mind learned quickly that engaging too deeply carried consequences, but disengaging was no longer possible. Once noticed, the forgotten lives did not release attention easily. The most disturbing change was emotional neutrality. Reactions dulled, not flattened completely, but delayed. Joy arrived late. Concern felt distant. It was as though emotional responses were being filtered, measured, and rationed. This was not numbness, but displacement. Something else occupied the space where immediate feeling should have lived, something patient and attentive. Over time, the realization formed that the cost was not punishment. It was transfer. Awareness was being redistributed, drawn away from the self and into the space where those abandoned lives remained suspended. Remembering them required giving up a portion of inner territory. The mind adjusted by shrinking, by making room. The danger was not that this would escalate suddenly, but that it would normalize. That the altered state would begin to feel ordinary, acceptable, even preferable. The thought emerged uncomfortably often that forgetting oneself might be easier than carrying the weight of remembering others who were never meant to be recalled, and that this erosion was not a side effect but the mechanism itself, ensuring that anyone who uncovered the truth would eventually become quieter, less defined, and easier to remove, until the mind reached the same stillness as the building, occupied yet unacknowledged, present but no longer fully its own.